Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, When Forces Collide, the Threats Shaping 2024 and Beyond. My name is Courtney Stafford. I'm the VP of Marketing at Infinite Blue. So I did want to welcome everybody again. Thanks for joining us today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. So first off, I'd like to introduce Frank Shultz. He is the founder of Infinite Blue in 2013 with a distinctly different vision for enterprise, business continuity, and disaster recovery. At a time when business continuity and disaster recovery was the manual process designed to meet audit requirements, Frank envisioned something automated, integrated, predictive, and in a crisis, actionable. Presently, Infinite Blue leads the industry with its offerings BC in the Cloud and Sonari. Next, I'd like to introduce Sara Pratley. She serves as the Senior Vice President of Global Intelligence at AlertMedia, where she oversees a team of analysts dedicated to identifying and assessing global threats and incidents. Prior to AlertMedia, she has held a series of senior roles at CNN for over a decade, leading coverage on major U.S. events, including natural disasters, mass shootings, and civil unrest. With a focus on global events and trend analysis, Sara applies her extensive media experience to keep audiences informed about disruptive events, leveraging her insights to anticipate and mitigate risks. Well, let's get into today's agenda. We will begin by reviewing the threat landscape, then take some time to look into the top threats to watch in 2024, followed by best practices, and then we will close with the Q&A. So like I said, feel free to add any questions into the chat throughout today's presentation. So before we get started, we wanted to launch a quick poll here. Hopefully everyone can see the poll that we have. We wanted to take a moment to just gauge where our audience is. So how would you rate your organization's emergency preparedness and response efforts in 2023? And we have a bunch of people answering. It looks like good and adequate are in the lead right now. No one has poor, which that's good to see. So thank you all for answering. I will just leave this open for a couple more seconds, and then we'll share the results so everyone can see where we're at. All right. So it looks like we had 48% of today's attendees with good, followed by 28% with adequate. So that's
awesome to see. Courtney, you mentioned it. I think it's great that nobody is in poor, which is awesome, and there's room for improvement, which is good.
There's room to expand, but we're generally doing okay, I'd say, given that. So awesome. Well, thank you, Courtney.
Yeah. So we'll kick it off to you, Frank. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I think if we look at 2023, it really is interesting what we saw kind of change. And, I'm not going to read everything on the slide. Please feel free to take a look. But looking at 2023, the natural weather impacts, it's not surprising when you take at least a couple of these boxes out of here. 2023 was the hottest year in human history. Also, the acres of wildfires doubled going into kind of 2023 from what we saw in the 90s. And there were more billion-dollar disasters in the United States than any previous year. We broke records there. We're going to talk a little bit about ransomware attacks and cyber attacks and political unrest as we go forward. But it's not surprising the amount of events and impacts hitting everybody is drastically increasing, which is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, for sure. I think you hit the nail on the head there, Frank. Everything seemingly is increasing, and I think the data definitely shows it. I think it's really helpful in these situations to share a lot of data. The macro perspective, I think, is a really great place for us to start when we think about the trends in data. The information you guys are seeing right now on the screen is actually from Allianz. They put out a risk barometer every year. They've been doing it for more than a decade. It's a really awesome resource. I would highly recommend it. But they survey thousands of risk management professionals and experts around the globe, really focused on the top risks facing businesses around the year and really for the year ahead. And there's a few things I'll point out about the data. Again, I'd really encourage folks to take a deeper dive into it. But cyber remains number one, and it's remained number one for the third consecutive year. And it's by a pretty significant margin when you look at the data from the survey. It ranked number one across all segments, as well as all regions of the globe. So I think that's a really important one to call out. Business interruption ranked number two, and it's the second year in a row that it's ranked number two on the risk barometer. Supply chain is really the big factor that generally resonates with organizations when they're checking that box and when they're thinking about that. Obviously, I think we all can consider supply chain disruptions when we think about the pandemic, but really in recent years, there's a lot of implications when we think about climate, as well as geopolitical events that are happening, especially right now. And then the last thing I would point out is natural catastrophes. They increased or on the list year over year. It actually was a pretty significant move. It went from number 6 on the risk barometer last year to number 3. Frank just mentioned the hottest year on record. I know we're in the 9th consecutive year or 9th consecutive month, actually, of heat records as well globally. So not super surprising that risk professionals are definitely kind of taking notice of that as well. So Frank, I know you had some other kind of compelling data that you guys collected too that I think would be helpful to share.
Yeah, at Infinite Blue, we surveyed some of our customers, those in the industry, for business continuity, disaster recovery, and resilience. And it's not surprising, a lot of the risks stacked up pretty close to the Alliance surveys. So economic factors, obviously 43% were concerned that this was one of the greatest risks that they perceived. Natural disasters, again, not surprising, lined up second. It's really hard to be really anywhere and not have some sort of an impact, whether it be flooding or heat. I think in the Northeast, snow was less of a factor this year, but it's either drought or heat or something that's happening, and we're all feeling the impact of that. And third, I know we're going to unpack this a little bit, Sarah, is the geopolitical risk. And I think we have a whole section on that we're going to talk about, but clearly people are thinking about it. So it's something that's top of mind. We actually went on and, we wanted to see if people thought this was going to get better or worse over the next 2 years. I don't know if it's good news or bad news. It's good news we're aware that it could get worse, but it's bad news to say that 68% of those that we surveyed actually said that they expect there to be more disruptions over the next 24 months than we had seen in the previous period. And again, looking primarily in future forecasting, economic downturn, market disruptions as the greatest threat, with 44% indicating that was their area of greatest impact, and natural disasters second, followed by supply chain disruption. So pretty consistent data from what we're seeing kind of on both sides from the Alliance report, which is interesting, and always interesting too, Sarah, when we ask employees what they're concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is definitely a different approach we try and take at, when we think about the different risks that people are thinking about. So at AlertMedia, we do an employee safety report every year. We survey employees in different industries, different markets, different sectors. And there's a lot of things that generally stand out. I'll point out a few things, but when you think about kind of that employee perspective, really the one question that we really wanted to pick apart today is helping us to understand what employees are concerned about when it comes to risks as it applies to the workplace and the work that they're doing. And severe weather, as you just mentioned, Frank, I think this is coming up a lot, even just a few minutes in. Severe weather ranked number 1 for the first time on our survey. It was number 5 last year. So it was still important to people, but it's seemingly more important. And I think as we take a look at the headlines and even just some of the historic data and information, it definitely resonates with employees really around the globe. Workplace violence too, up year over year in the survey. I think a lot of people can kind of reflect on that. It's not super surprising, but definitely something to point out. And then the percent of our respondents that were concerned about property damage and loss doubled year over year, which is interesting to kind of take a look at. I definitely, again, really good data here. I would encourage folks to take a look at. I think we've got our full report coming out next week. So something folks can download, but it's called the Employee Safety Report. Just again, another really good thing to kind of couple with all of this data to really reflect on the different things that are happening around businesses. And Frank, I know we have a little bit more on weather too, which I think is important. It really hits everybody across different industries.
Yeah, definitely. Like, it's not a surprise that employees are concerned, as their number one area of concern are natural weather or natural disasters, weather disasters. There's a couple sites I love to pull data from. Our World in Data is a great one. Unfortunately, when I pulled this, they still don't have past September of 23. as far as the aggregate goes here, but I can imagine it's going to stack up pretty close or above 22. But you're seeing over time as number one, data got better, so we accounted for better data. So if you maybe discount a little bit before the 90s or so, you can see we get better results as we go on. But the increase of volume of natural disasters, you can see some of the types like flood start to open up a little bit, extreme weather, which is pretty much a bucket for a lot of specific activities, but they kind of bucket some of these severe cold, severe heat on both sides here, with temperature is increasing over time. And my other favorite report, I don't do all the doomsday insights all the time here, but my other one is to go to FEMA's website. If you're in the US, FEMA has amazing data that will come out as far as National Risk Index, but they also put out their for the calendar year, how many billion-dollar weather events that we've seen. And as I said earlier, I don't know if this is a record we want to break, but we broke the record for number of billion-dollar weather events in the United States. This may actually increase because they'll keep tallying the number up as they accrue impact. But we had 28 separate billion-dollar weather incidents, and they're primarily, in 23 clustered generally across the Midwest and central part of the country and kind of the South Central, Southeast. But previous years, we've seen them kind of be more on the West Coast, and it really just depends year over year, kind of where those impacts are occurring. The reality of it is it's not getting any easier. We're seeing these layered crises happen as well. So, the term that we've coined is a polycrisis. And your organizations, they're not dealing with just one event at a time. And so traditional, if you think about business continuity, we'd have a plan for every type of scenario. And the reality was, COVID-19 especially taught us you have to deal with the pandemic, you're dealing with supply chain issues, you're dealing with economic impacts, civil unrest, and the natural weather disasters didn't stop, nor did the cyber attacks. And so we're just finding that organizations have to really be prepared to deal with anything hitting them at any time. And you can't just look in your borders anymore, right? So, as we go kind of the next area, the geopolitical conflicts, I can't ignore what's happening outside of my own country anymore, right, Sarah?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely those reverberating impacts. And as you think about kind of that concept of the polycrisis, I think it's a great way to really frame it as there generally seems to be more than one incident happening, especially as they impact different businesses around the globe. So we've obviously established there's numerous different events that are happening around the globe with severities. But that said, there are a few areas in particular I thought we could really kind of focus on today. The geopolitical conflicts are obviously kind of stacking up. And as I mentioned, those reverberating impacts are really one of the things that we've been seeing, especially in recent years, and paying attention to in particular. We've, of course, this is no surprise, right? We've all been paying attention to the war between Russia and Ukraine, everything that's happening on the ground in Ukraine in particular. I mean, we're still seeing near daily activity there. We've, of course, got a new war in the Middle East with implications, not just there across the region, but of course, reverberating around the world, especially as we think about everything that's happening in the Red Sea right now, with supply chain crises there. Just, again, domino effect. Continued tensions between China and Taiwan. That's something we can't necessarily ignore. Instability across the Sahel region of Africa. I know that's one that not many people necessarily pay attention to. It feels really remote, but there are important implications for the entirety of the globe when we think about that region and area. And then, as of late, we've seen an increase in activity across the Korean Peninsula. We're seeing, obviously, the US and Japan and areas over there that obviously were launching different efforts. But of course, with North Korea launching a spy satellite at the end of last year, just a few months ago, we're, of course, seeing a lot more concerns. And as all these conflicts continue to really show us, I think the one thing is that there's that polycrisis, there's multiple things happening at once, but it's also not necessarily the case that these sorts of incidents are just having an impact localized or even in the region. We really are seeing a lot of things play out across the globe. So we just wanted to pick apart here a few of the different things that we're kind of seeing as it pertains to the business community, right? These things have impacts to the local communities. They generally have humanitarian impacts, but there's a lot of things that really continue to impress upon the different business communities communities and just kind of the global community. First one, no surprise here, right? Supply chain. We've already mentioned it a few times. I mentioned the Red Sea and the conflict that's happening in the Middle East. Tensions in the South China Sea obviously could really impact that as well, especially when you layer on kind of the poly crisis that we think about when we think about climate change as well. We're seeing a lot of different climate implications when it comes to supply chain, but when you layer on the geopolitical events that are happening, it's really kind of that double whammy there. These crises are also perpetuating new waves of migration around the globe, really adding to geopolitical situations in different regions. So when you think about the way that people are moving away from some of these crises or really trying to flee different countries or regions where they're happening, we see more of an impact on those localized communities. We see kind of the impress upon people that are trying to help, but also communities that are trying to take them in. I know the European Union recently released some data on asylum applications. Those are at the highest level in more than a decade, which is obviously very concerning. There's a lot of politics around that there as well. And of course, I know as we sit in North America, a lot of us think about what's happening at the US and Mexico border, but also the US-Canadian border as we see different migration efforts. Rising energy costs, they're impacting not only businesses, but we think about employees here as well, especially as we think about employees that are working from home. So, that's its own poly crisis in itself. The economy, both regionally and globally, there's no shortage of kind of conversation points that we could have around how interconnected the global economy is and how different impacts from these different events can really have a significant impact on the global economy and obviously all the businesses that are woven into that. And then lastly, I mentioned the Sahel region of Africa, and I call it out again here, as well as what's happening in the Middle East. There's definitely renewed concerns over terrorism globally and different attacks, different incidences that could happen and different kind of regional implications for different groups too. And then as we think about this, we've got some other data on this next slide. Another factor that we really think about with businesses right now is the travel implications. So business travel is on the rise. I know a lot of us are back on the road, basically back to pre-pandemic levels or near that, making it more important than ever to really understand the risk landscape as it pertains to different areas of the company, especially with business travelers. I know that a lot of folks are going into areas that they might not necessarily be as accustomed to, but also into regions that are on the periphery of different things like the war in the Middle East, different things that are happening in Europe and just around the globe. So Frank, I know you have some more great thoughts when it comes to kind of managing and mitigating some of these risks in these areas as well.
Absolutely, right. We can't just look at what's within our kind of borders and kind of our four walls because people are traveling more. Clearly, there's a global supply chain type of impact and all the impacts you talked about, Sarah. But, I think from our perspective, as we look at this, it's really taking a pivot in the way that we assess and prepare ourselves to respond to these type of impacts and events. And really, it's to adopt an all asset and all hazard based approach. And what I mean by that is to be able to understand the landscape of where your business operates, your employees, your third parties, your locations that you have. Could be data centers where maybe there's not a whole lot of staff there, but there are critical functions there, or third party data centers. And just to understand the interconnections of all of those parts and pieces, because it really is hard as you think about this to understand when an impact occurs in one area. It's easier to understand that specific impact. It's harder if you're not prepared to understand how that can ripple out through your organization over time. And so there's two areas that we really want to see organizations kind of respond to here and think a little differently in the wake of what's happening. And one of those is to really tap into operational systems that already exist today. So it's not about creating a whole new data set of new information. It's about taking the data you have for people, for your operational data, your financial data, third-party assets, real estate, if you're an organization that has a large footprint of locations, and interweaving that in a way that when something happens, you have a really clear understanding of those connected pathways. And that's really going to be helpful. So if someone is traveling, you understand their area of responsibility, where they're traveling to, what the impact might be as a result if they have, maybe they can't access the internet for a while, or maybe something more catastrophic happens. You can understand very quickly who's been impacted, how that can impact both them personally and then the business. And likewise, if you have a location where there are more than one employee impacted or more than one process or function impacted, how that affects the entire organization. And we really see a lot of this as a shift into that resilience thinking, away from kind of continuity planning to be able to anticipate anything. And it really will help as we kind of look at really the forecast of where we're going.
Yeah, that concept of being able to look around the corner as much as possible and hopefully anticipate what's coming.
Absolutely.
And another key area that we thought would be really important to kind of talk about today, and one that we closely monitor, is the rise in global activism. We have a tactical and strategic team within our organization. They pay particularly close attention. They're tracking a lot of different events that are happening globally. So we can dive into a little bit of the data that we were able to pull from them. And what we're seeing right now is definitely a huge increase in uptick in such events, protests, demonstrations, just kind of civil unrest that kind of fall out of those events as well. But when we think about just 2022 to 2023, so just looking back at the last few years, our team saw more than a 40% increase in the number of events that are happening in this area, in particular, protests and demonstrations. And I think it's important to note, like, it's a huge number, right? It looks like a very, very major increase, and it is. It is a large number. It is a large increase. A lot of this can be attributed to what we saw happening after October 7th. The number of pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli rallies that were happening globally that our team was tracking obviously rose significantly in the days and weeks, and obviously even months. We're still seeing campaigns almost every weekend around the globe. But that was definitely a huge contributing factor when we think about these numbers. Aside from the war in the Middle East and those kind of reverberating impacts with demonstrations, we've also seen an uptick in demonstrations really surrounding different geopolitical events. Some of the ones that we mentioned in kind of the last section, climate change and climate activism, women's reproductive rights, something we expect to see more of on the horizon as well here in the United States in particular. And then labor activism is another big one, and we'll drill down into that one a little bit further because I think it's important to call out some different statistics there, because we've seen quite a few things. First off, nearly 500,000 people in the US alone last year went on strike. Much of that was across the entertainment industry. I think a lot of us probably paid attention to that, but healthcare, auto workers as well. Lots of implications there that we saw. So, it's more than just the entertainment industry. Just when we think about it kind of more holistically, even just the number of people that are joining unions is on the rise. More than 190,000 people were newly unionized workers. So new folks joining unions here in the United States last year. Definitely a number that we're paying close attention to. One of the things I was listening to recently was just some speculation too, that as we see the rise of artificial intelligence, that this may be a new area that unions take a particular interest in. So we'll definitely be watching to see if that has any implications there. And then public opinion too, in addition to just the number of people joining unions, folks that aren't in unions necessarily are still continuing to support the efforts. The support itself for unions and unionized workers has risen a ton. It's actually at the highest that it's been in decades. And I know I focused a lot on US-based data here, but this is obviously not just focused towards the United States. When we see a lot of these demonstrations and activity, labor activism in particular, we're paying a lot of attention right now to what's happening over in Europe, as well as Asia with the farmer strikes and the farmers protests. We just had medical students across South Korea that were on strike. And then there's numerous transportation disruptions, transportation strikes that are continuously happening across Europe as well. So just a lot of interconnected nature here and a lot of things that really resonate globally. And
Definitely
then
can affect, yeah, this can definitely affect organizations, even if it's not. If you look on the categories on the left here for strikes, right, you're obviously seeing the impacts ripple from those,
yeah,
Sarah, right? Like, it's not just if you're directly affected.
absolutely. I mean, just so much interconnectivity when we think about these different events, not only in our professional lives, in our personal lives as well.
Absolutely.
As we think about demonstrations, we'd obviously be remiss if we didn't talk about elections in the election cycle. Of course, here in the U.S., a lot of us are paying attention to what is happening with we're now in the general election in the United States, one of the longest general elections ever. But when we think about the globe as a whole, there's more than 50 countries this year that will go to the polls for national elections, which equates to just an amazing number of people, more than 3 billion people that will be qualified to go to the polls this year and vote in their countries. Again, we're keeping a close eye on things here in the United States. There's a lot of implications. There's the potential for a lot of demonstrations and kind of domino effect activities. But, Mexico could elect their first female president amidst the growing migration crisis in Central and North America. The UK is looking for their third prime minister in 18 months. Of course, a lot to say about that. And then recently, we actually focused a lot on Pakistan. There was a lot of controversy and conversation around misinformation in particular as it came to the elections there. So, we think about a lot of these events. We think about the elections. There's obviously demonstration activity in different locations. There's the potential for civil unrest, but also as we just kind of expand the lens, watching geopolitical implications as different governments and different global economy implications are at play and interwoven, questions about election security, how AI and misinformation could play in as well. So many interconnected factors that we're keeping an eye on here. And I think, Frank, it's obviously, something that's evolving and making people shift their perspective.
Absolutely. You remind me talking about the supply chain impacts kind of coming out of COVID. I'll never forget my wife ordered one of our daughters some water shoes, I think it was, or sneakers, and literally the shipping manifest said delayed by oceanic congestion. Which was the first time in my life I've ever seen that. But it just shows the interconnectedness of what we're experiencing, and it's universal. I think everything we're saying, Sarah, like you can't outrun this and you can't ignore it. Right. So, just shifting this mindset, there are some things we can prevent, and there are things that we just have to have a plan to respond to. And so it's always interesting, if you think about why are there sprinklers in a building? Well, it's not to prevent a fire, it's to give people a chance to exit before the fire burns the building, and potentially to limit the spread of the fire. So, there's a couple things that we can put in check here to maybe kind of limit that impact, but we can't stop weather events. We can't stop kind of the global supply chain type of impact of things out of our control. And it's a shift of mindset, really from this prevention mindset to a resilience mindset. Sorry, as I'm talking, my office lights turned off on me. So the resilience mindset, and I'll be resilient here as I go through. The resilience mindset for us is being able to respond to anything, no matter what it is. It could be a direct impact in your organization. It could be an impact that occurs from external factors, third parties that have an issue, that have a failure, and you need to be able to respond. So it's, again, understanding the data connections and understanding how everything knits together in a way that you can come back and hopefully respond quickly and reduce that time from impact to understanding to recovery and learn something from it, which I think is really important. I'll tell you what you can't do. You can't do it without having an interconnection across levels in the organization. And so in the picture in the background here, I'm coming in today from outside of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania here, and we have an Amish community that's nearby in Lancaster. There are barn buildings that happen in the community, and everyone comes together. They'll build a barn for a family over a day or over a weekend, and it's an amazing effort of people coming together. And we really see organizations do this when they have an impact that impacts different people across different levels of the organization. But seeing the collaboration and the buy-in from the top level, we're seeing more boards and C-suites wanting to get involved in resilience and recovery than we've ever seen in the past. And that effect ripples down through the rest of the organization. What's really positive about this is when we asked in our survey at the end of 2023 about understanding resilience and the importance of that, 61% of those that we surveyed said that they do understand the importance of BCDR, and 53% actually suggested or strongly agreed, I should say, or agreed that their organization's making the necessary investments to be resilient. We love to see that number go up year over year. The number of organizations that recognize the importance has gone up year over year. The investment's kind of lagging a little bit behind it, but the good factor in all this is only 4% believe their organization was not committing the resources needed. And so that's definitely an important factor. We're seeing that number trend down, but disruptions can hit you from any aspect. And I think, Sarah, we've talked around kind of digital disruption and cyber, but there's a lot that is affecting organizations today from a digital perspective, given our dependency on IT and anything connected to a computer or phone.
Yeah, and there's so many things we can talk about when we think about digital disruption. And I think you just mentioned kind of the two categories, right? The two things we tend to most prominently focus on right now, or maybe most prominently, would be cybersecurity. But also that rise in artificial intelligence has definitely become a huge topic of conversation amongst many. It really doesn't matter what industry or what business, but definitely a lot that we can unpack here. So when we think about cybersecurity first, we saw that Allianz data. It's obviously top of the list for risk professionals globally. And with good reason. Last year, the average cost of a data breach was nearly $4.5 million. So just incredible costs. That's something that we're seeing trending up. The numbers are continuing to kind of trend in that wrong direction as far as just kind of the number as well as the cost associated with the recovery efforts for organizations. And then we also continue to see an uptick of data breaches in particular. I think important to note that more than 30% of these events are usually caused by some sort of human error. Plenty of things we could probably point to in recent headlines where we see these things having impacts not only on business communities, but communities around the world just in general. And then this last stat here, I just think this is incredible. More than 1.6 billion phishing emails sent globally last year. That shattered previous records. The previous record was 1.16. So it's still a big number, but significantly lower back in 2021. One of the most popular things that we're seeing right now when it comes to phishing emails too is the impersonation of big brands, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, things that we and our employees trust and are used to seeing, right? And things that you would be more kind of recognizing and things that you might click on a little bit easier. So definitely something to really keep in mind there as we think about phishing emails. And then critical infrastructure, I think, is one that we focus on a good bit, but maybe not enough. This is another one, too, where I think there's a lot of vulnerabilities, but also those reverberating impacts. Unfortunately, critical infrastructure takes a pretty big brunt of cyber attacks. A third of ransomware attacks in particular across the US impact the infrastructure in particular. And you can see from this data, they've picked apart 10 different areas that are represented, all of them experiencing not only a higher volume, but higher by a pretty significant amount. The data outlined here in these red and blue bars is from 2022 to 2023. And a lot of these things you can see are jumping, some of them more than 50%. So just really staggering numbers as we think about different areas of critical infrastructure that are interwoven into a lot of the things that we're doing, not only in communities, but just in business in general, that are taking a pretty massive hit from these different sorts of events. And then along with cyber events, like I said, digital disruption for us is also a big topic when it comes to artificial intelligence. I know I love talking on this topic. It's one of those things that I feel like there's so much to be gained here. There's so many amazing things that are happening because of AI, especially because of the rapid advancement over the last several months, but also so many kind of crazy things that we're all fearing, I think, as we see different headlines as well. And we just kind of packed a few of them in here just for the purposes of this conversation. But, who wouldn't be excited about AI when you think about all the climate change impacts that it could be having in the different scientific communities that are using it to apply to data and hopefully find different solutions there. Of course, all of the stuff that's happening within medical research. There's so many exciting things that are happening with AI there. But then one of the things you see on both ends of the spectrum is misinformation. Of course, on the positive side, we have organizations in big tech who are really helping to expose misinformation and fake information using AI. But then on the negative end of the spectrum, we of course see that it's AI in many cases that is being used to create and propagate that sort of information. So just, even seeing some of these controversial headlines or just things that kind of sit on both ends of the spectrum are really interesting. And then I mentioned phishing emails earlier. Those are of course growing in kind of size capacity. When we look at the global economy and global businesses, but just the fact that AI is being used in general to create a lot of those is also concerning as well.
I saw there was an article, I think it was our podcast this morning article. I listen to so much news sometimes I forget where it came from, but literally around the impact of AI on advertisement, which you literally, if you told an AI to filter out ads for you, imagine the impact that could have potentially on those that are dependent on ad-based revenue, which is something I think I hadn't even thought about until I read that this morning. Just a crazy impact, Sarah. It's,
Yeah. And again, you can look at it both ends of the spectrum, right? The
Yep.
ad revenue that would, obviously disappear, but then a lot of people would say, but look at all the efficiencies if I'm not having to look at the
Exactly.
ads. Get from point A to
But
point
now I
B
have to pay.
Yeah.
Now I have to pay for things because the way they're funded is through ads. And clearly, the adoption of AI has been kind of an interesting journey to look at.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And we talk about AI, it's definitely not something that's new, right? Artificial intelligence has been around for a long time. We talk about it a lot more now because in recent months, especially over the past year, we've seen such an incredible kind of like acceleration of all of the technology, the exposure to main populations, right? People having access at their fingertips. And that really has bled into the business place. We definitely see a lot of businesses really adopting currently and planning to adopt in the future. Some great numbers here. More than 30% of businesses already using some sort of generative AI in the business that they're doing right now. And then 40% of organizations saying, yeah, I'm going to add there as well. I'm either already using it and have more plans for the future, or maybe I'm not using it yet, but I'm going to start. We definitely see a lot of organizations that are seeing different efficiencies, different opportunities, and for a lot of good reasons. One of the stats, or the one stat here that is definitely disturbing, is just as we kind of pull and leverage different information, we see that most companies don't have any sort of AI policy. When we talk to different groups that don't, it is really eye-opening to see kind of the wild, wild west mentality, or that a lot of organizations might not necessarily think that people internally are leveraging artificial intelligence in some way to do their job. And without that policy, obviously all the vulnerabilities that can be opened when you think about everything that's being done internally, but also with other businesses and for customers. So I think it's important to kind of market these things and maybe think on them as different organizations and how you can have an impact within your business as far as it pertains to things like digital disruption, but AI in particular.
Yeah, I know when we at Infinite Blue, it's probably a year and a half ago, we were looking at building AI into Sonari, which we've done, and built machine learning models. We came up with our own internal policy, and I remember we went to our law firm that we use, which is not a small firm, and said, what's a template, or can you help us with this? And they actually told us we were one of the first organizations to ask them for that, which was kind of surprising, which was about a year and a half ago. But as kind of more prevalent providers like Microsoft and Google allow organizations to turn on AI technology like Microsoft Copilot in kind of a click, it's interesting to not have a policy around that. It's really easy to turn it on. It's also really easy to go into Chat GPT or one of the other ones and just say, I'm going to paste something in here or ask it a question. And we saw employers obviously or employees, I should say, confidential data in, and
Oh, wow.
without a warning.
Yeah, it's
So
definitely the balance, right? Opportunities and risks. One of the things we talk a lot about internally, because we too use artificial intelligence. We have a whole team of intelligence professionals that are sifting through a lot of different information. We've built our own AI internally to collect information for them and help them sift through it. But the thing that we see is just the responsibility of that human interaction, right? A human in the loop, human vetting process. And really, I think that's where the magic spot is right now, coupling AI with human beings with that expertise. Whether it's within the intelligence security space or beyond, it really does feel like, that's striking the right balance at this point.
absolutely.
All right. I'll pass it back to Courtney, because who doesn't love another poll?
Yes. So before Frank and Sarah discuss ways that you can mitigate the risks of these types of business impacts, we're going to jump into another poll to gauge how our audience is feeling so far about some of the trends we've covered in today's webinar.
I'm
So which
interested.
of these 5 threats will be the highest priority for you in 2024? It is looking like cyber is taking the lead right now, and I'll share these results. We'll just give a few more seconds here.
Did we influence this, Sarah, by talking about cyber at the end before we did this poll, or
Maybe.
I don't
I
know?
think too, and I know Courtney will share the results in a second, but I think as we look at this too, a lot of this is really reflective of what we're seeing with some of the other surveys that we're doing within our organizations, or even that Alliance Risk Barometer. So I think, obviously the audience is on pulse with that.
Definitely.
Yeah, so it looks like we landed with 60% cybersecurity risks,
Well
followed by
above.
severe weather, 18%.
Yeah, well above everything. Wow. That's super interesting. But as you said, Sarah, spot on with where we're seeing a lot of the concerns. For what people you think about the aspect of what will you be working on, what will you be responding to, and kind of what's a large impact to your organization potentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, really interesting. So I think, when we look at this, and overall kind of the prescriptive part of this is being able to anticipate what's going to impact your organization, which is really important. So, one of the other aspects is building the capacity for the ability to predict those impacts. Really important. understanding, kind of historically areas that your organization has seen events, has seen incidents pop up, has seen some kind of an impact to your efficiency and your ability to run operations, but also being able to predict what's going to come. And just because you experienced something last year doesn't mean that's necessarily going to be the highly probable or highly impactful type of event you're going to experience in the future. So, really important to get tied into the threat intelligence, both internally and externally, to have an understanding of what's really happening and what's really impacting your organization. When we surveyed those that participated in our global resilience survey, sorry, there were three key areas that we saw that were missed opportunities. One of them on the bottom here is that prediction capability, which is to be able to really understand impacts when they occur and before they occur. So what is something that's highly likely for my organization to experience? But also really interesting, engaging third-party vendors in their resilience program, really understanding what you take kind of an outsource outside of the four walls of your organization, for those that you have dependencies on, what they're providing you, how you can engage them to make sure that they are taking the same or better care of your services or your data that you're putting in their hands than you would internally. Because we all share this kind of same level of potential impact and the same level of risks, no matter where we're at. The collaboration piece is really key as well. A missed opportunity to think about who you engage in your organization as far as where you can take that and go forward. So these three areas, from a prescriptive perspective, we really think will overcome or help organizations to overcome the ability strengthen the ability for them to respond when something happens. And I'm always focused when an impact occurs, it's the time between impact and understanding and recovery. If we can shorten that cycle between those three events, the impact, the understanding, and the recovery, we actually can benefit and hopefully have less impact in the long term across the organization. Now, when we look at this is really interesting about what we think is going to occur. We've talked about the concerns that the employees have. We've talked about where things are trending overall. And it's really interesting when we look at this, what are the potential incidents that we foresee as a result of this? And then what are the impacts that you may see as a result of those specific incidents? And so we've talked around a couple of these, but as you kind of group them together, geopolitical tensions, domestic political upheaval, localized civil unrest, as we're going through terrorism acts, kind of knitted together in some of the data that we're seeing are of highest concerns for individuals. Specifically in our poll, the cyber incidents, ransomware attacks, weather events we talked about as well, and just the aspect of extreme weather, forest fires specifically, and wildfires are an area of high concern, which can cause infrastructure disruptions, potential economic impacts. So on the right side of the screen, if you think about the things to prepare for on the left side, and you think about how it could impact your organization on the right, and we actually have a pretty interesting chart in our report, which we'll share in a little bit here, around what to look out for. But some of these organizations aren't necessarily looking out for, like, how can this cause brand harm potentially for me? Or how can this cause essentially financial pressures on my organization in a way that we didn't anticipate? Data or system loss as a result of some type of an impact occurring. And as Sarah, as you talked about earlier, as we see kind of disruptions occur, protests, those are going to have unintended impacts, whether it's a protest in our specific industry or not. Just the geography of where those protests occur are going to cause impacts on organizations.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we think about when we think about, the demonstration activity that we're seeing the uptick in, as well as generally business continuity, right? Most of these things that we're seeing planned are groups that are obviously trying to, get their word out, support something, support a cause, support people, and generally their business continuity issues at the onset. People gathered in places, maybe slowing traffic, slowing, business traffic and things like that. But what we are seeing is we're seeing a lot of these demonstrations as counter demonstrations coming out, people with differing opinions that can incite potential violence, that can create potentially difficult situations. And then, of course, as we see different civil unrest around surveillance situations, we see not only violence, but it may be even vandalism to buildings. So a lot that can continue to be anticipated there, especially I think with the notion that these are the sorts of events that you generally can know about ahead of time, right? So as a business continuity or resiliency professional, you can at least take some action ahead of time, or at least prepare in some way that feels good for the organization and the employees.
Absolutely. You think about one of the, I think about natural weather events and you think about the difference of a tornado and a hurricane, right? So one you clearly can see coming and one on the other side is very quick, very rapid. There are a lot of things, as you said, Sarah, we can kind of see coming, which is helpful to understand how we're going to respond to it.
Absolutely.
We're going to open it up to questions here, and we have a couple. If you go into the Q&A box here, you are able to ask us some questions as we'll open this up. If you stay tuned for a little bit, we do have a poll, and we have some links with QR codes directly to our reports from both Infinite Blue and AlertMedia that we'll share in just a second. But Courtney wanted to open it up back to you and see if we did have any questions from the group.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. We do have a few that have come in. So the first one I think is for you. What's the biggest mistake companies make when prepping for emergencies?
That is a great question. I think what I've seen, if you are so focused on the last impactful thing that impacted your organization, and that's really the only thing you're focused on, you can actually not see things kind of coming in your periphery that may actually be more impactful, or maybe something that you didn't ever think could occur. So a lot of times we'll see organizations that have a cyber event. All of a sudden, kind of the cyber event occurs on a Thursday, and the next Monday there are 40 job postings for cybersecurity staff, which is a great way to get cybersecurity staff if that's where we need to fund, but not at the expense of other things that could impact the organization. So, we typically like to see organizations kind of balanced in a way that they're able to understand where their exposures could be and understand the relationship of data, but not lean too hard into any one area, because there really are a barrage of events that could occur multiple at once in a polycrisis type of scenario. But you have to be able to be nimble. Don't have the recency bias that I think a lot of organizations get. Sarah, I don't know if you'd have anything to add on to that.
Yeah, I just think in the concept of the polycrisis too, I think a lot of organizations will try and focus on one thing at once and not necessarily think about redundancies that they need in place. And when I think about redundancies for a polycrisis too, it's like, do you have the people to lead these different sorts of crises internally, or respond to either mitigate risk or to, respond on the back end? So thinking about that too as well, personnel across teams, and making sure that you have people that are capable of leading, whether separately or in tandem when you have multiple things happening at once. I think it's definitely an area people are thinking a bit more about as we're seeing multiple things happening at once, but I think it's definitely a vulnerability too.
Awesome.
Great. It looks like we have another question here. I think this one is for Sarah. Is there an increase in cyber risk for business travelers?
Absolutely. I know we talked a little bit about cyber. I think we threw up a slide too. We travel kind of security and travel numbers just in general, business travelers going up. But it's one of the things we think about, I guess, most often when we think about folks traveling to different areas, right? There's the physical security risks. There's being aware of your surroundings, understanding different geopolitical events, demonstrations, things happening in the area. But cybersecurity is definitely a huge risk. We definitely see a lot of organizations as they're doing kind of those pre-travel briefings, looking at where their employees are traveling and taking into consideration the technology that they're taking with them, technology they shouldn't be taking with them, kind of repurposing things. So there's definitely a higher risk there. And I would just encourage organizations to have those conversations on the front end, not only to understand kind of that cyber risk landscape to the locations people are going to, but what ways you can help mitigate the risk for your organization as well as the individual, right? And different technology that they're taking with them while they're on the ground.
Yeah, I can probably, maybe I can save $1 million globally by just reminding everybody not to plug into a USB outlet on a wall with a data device. It's really tempting.
All right, I have another question here. In thinking about AI and its potential, today is the least capable it will be. With that framing in mind, what do you see the threat horizon being around how AI will be leveraged for aggregation and amplification of bias?
Wow.
I can jump
Sarah,
in
you
on
want to take that one? Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, I think A lot of really good points in this question. I think number one, yes, AI is only going to get better at doing a lot of different things, which will have the positives and negatives, right? We're seeing a lot of benefits of AI in research. We mentioned medical research. As AI continues to advance, we do, expect that we're going to see bad actors continue to leverage that. I think it's keeping an eye on the ways that it's being used and being leveraged that are going to be most helpful. I think it's definitely scary. I think we're definitely going to see different biases coming out, sometimes because of the information that is being created and propagated throughout. I think just bias towards or against AI just in general is a risk that we take as well. I know some organizations maybe don't want to partner with an organization that says, yes, I use artificial intelligence. So I think that's something that we need to keep in line of sight as well, and just kind of responsibly using technology, even though that technology is going to continue to evolve.
It is scary where it's going to go. Look, the technology exists today to give a generative AI a voice and an ear, if you will, to do text to speech and speech to text in a way, and to do voice cloning. And so, voice cloning is accessible to everybody. I think, if you want to just see how scary it can be, there's a company called 11 Labs that actually will let you clone a voice off of 25 seconds of video. Really kind of crazy. And, to the person who asked this question, it's going to get more and more accessible and easier for people to tie into it. So it is really something we need to be diligent about understanding and being able to respond to it.
All right, we have another question here from one of our attendees. Do you think that most organizations could benefit from a mind shift that accepts that they cannot stop bad things from happening, to one that focuses on how to prepare and respond when they do? Could they better focus limited resources?
Mind if I take this one, Sarah?
Go for it.
Yeah, I think everything that that I know I've talked about from a prescriptive perspective isn't to give organizations more work or to spend more money, but more to focus on not putting the scenario you're responding to first in your cycle of resilience. And so a lot of times, we'll see organizations that they'll create a data center recovery plan or a data center response plan. And it's every application, it's everything in a data center, whether it's a third-party data center or a company owned. And it works really well for what auditors are looking for. It checks the box that you've covered everything. And then that plan doesn't actually get utilized when something occurs because it's too high level or there's too much to it. And so, I think that shift is more to focus on understanding the interconnections of your organization and how things knit together. So if there is an impact on a specific asset, you understand the dependencies throughout the organization and you can dynamically respond. It's really hard for us, even looking at all the data that Sarah and I have pulled together from our organizations and from externally today. It's really hard for us to say, well, here's the top thing you should plan for and respond to, because it could be number 12 on that list that we could think of, the things that are impactful is the thing that actually is the next highly impactful thing in your organization. It's just really hard to sit here and say we know exactly what's going to occur in the future. Focus more on taking data you already have and tying that together in a way that makes it accessible so that you can understand the way your organization works and how it fits together. And that's going to evolve over time. And so that's why I always urge organizations to tie into operational data systems and make sure you understand who works where and what they're responsible for and what do we use that third-party vendor for and how do we get a hold of them if something goes wrong. You wouldn't believe how much time it takes when you don't have that up front. You can waste a lot of time.
Thanks, Frank. We did have a question at whether we will be sharing the recording, and yes, we will. So we will share that in the next few days along with the reports, and we have links to the reports coming up on one of the next slides. But it looks like we have time for, we had one more question.
Oh.
I don't know, Frank, if you, there was a question about expanding on the USB charging stations. Are they easily hacked or skimmed? I don't know if you have more information to share.
Yeah. Maybe I did save somebody here. I just flew back on a plane yesterday and there was a USB port staring me in the face on the seat back in front of me. There's two things you can do. So yes, you could actually potentially have a device behind that USB port that can download data from what you plug in. That's probably the biggest worry that I would have. There's two ways to mitigate that. You can actually get a cable that's a power only cable if you think you are going to need to plug into USB sockets on the wall. And all it does is connect the power to a device. It doesn't actually connect the lines that support data transmission. But really the safest thing is just throw one or two of those little USB power bricks in your bag, or a battery backup, and just use those. Like if you get a chance to just plug in to an actual outlet, you're always going to be safer doing that. However, make sure you buy that power brick from a reputable company. There are ones that have spying devices in them as well. If you don't buy them from a reputable company, it is amazing what's out there. That and not accessing or conducting confidential communications over public Wi-Fi are probably my two top traveler risk type of things for a cyber perspective.
I think most people are very familiar with just jumping on whatever Wi-Fi is accessible and not leveraging a VPN. It's such an easy thing to leverage the VPN. And somebody else, Jason, actually, one of the participants, he actually just called out to that power only cable, worth its weight in gold.
Definitely. Yeah. If in a pinch when you need a charge, you may need that. So worth throwing in your bag.
All
Courtney, I
right.
think we had one more poll. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is just our last poll. I know we shared a lot of information today. If there's anything either of our companies can help you with, or both of us, we would love to help in any way that we can, or if you have further questions. So I'll just leave this up for a few more seconds here if you would like to respond to that, and we would get back to you as soon as we can with more information to get you what you need. So this slide here, and I believe a link should have been shared as well. These are the reports that Sara and Frank have gone back to throughout this whole presentation. So feel free to download those through the QR codes that are here if you haven't already. So it's really great information here. And we will be sharing these out afterwards as well.
And for both of our organizations, these will be reports that we keep up to date not keep up to date, but renew every year as we go forward. And so, we're tracking obviously what's happening in 2024 and looking at the prediction for 2025 as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, we all believe in the same thing. Knowledge is power. The more knowledge we can bestow on each other and our communities, it's just, incredible, great ways for us to be able to prepare. And like I said, kind of look around the corner and be more prepared and resilient. Absolutely.
Sara, I want to thank you. This has been great today to come together with you on AlertMedia, and it's been hopefully our participants learned something today, and hopefully there's we sparked a thought, or we sparked not a concern, but hopefully an idea on how to address what could happen to their organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Better ways to plan and prepare, and hopefully respond.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Sara, again. And as Courtney said, we'll be following up with a communication afterwards. But thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.